We're going to talk today about using data to identify, understand, and drive effective organizational culture. The original title for this talk, A Newcomer Looks at Culture. I'm the newcomer. As you'll learn, Doug is not the newcomer. So like any good newcomer, I look to an expert to try to expand what I know. I spoke at CultureCon 2018, now several decades ago, I believe, and spoke on learning cultures. That really got me introduced to what does organizational culture mean, and started down that path. Pinning down the meaning of organizational culture was a pretty challenging task, and you'll start to get a sense of the journey that I made on these next several slides. If you look at SHRM, it's how things get done in your workplace. Hofstede, the programming of the human mind by which one group of people distinguishes itself from another group. I love the sounds of that. It sounds fantastically high-minded, somewhat different from SHRM. Josh Bersin, culture is what people do when nobody is looking. I love that definition. Again, now we're on to definition number 3. The fourth, Quinn Association, the behavior of people and organizations. Gallup, how we do things around here. So definitions are something of a mess, but at least there's some general agreement on what the dimensions of organizational culture are. 7 dimensions of organizational culture here discussed by Management Transitions. 5 dimensions of organizational culture, or 8, or 6. And a cursory web search also reveals 4, 9, 10, and 12. So if anyone would like to stake out some terrain, I'd suggest 11 is an excellent number. It hasn't been done before. This left me perhaps in a worse starting point than I was before I knew anything at all. So where should a leader looking to drive culture even begin? We've got 3 contentions here. The first is that organizational culture is more emergent from employee behavior than it is dictated by leadership. Second, we can use employee experience data to map dimensions of culture. And Doug will talk a little bit about how this differs from other approaches to creating that map. And leaders who know where their culture is on this map are best positioned to drive culture toward a desired objective. So let's start with this first point, that it's more emergent than it is dictated. It certainly doesn't come by fiat from leadership-authored mission, vision, and value statements. Those are all incredibly important in helping to shape culture, but they don't determine it. And I'm not saying that culture doesn't come from leadership, it does. The real challenge and the crux of it is that you've got leaders throughout your org chart. Frontline workers, all the way up to the C-suite, are all leaders in some way. And the bigger your organization gets, the more cultures it has at the individual, team, group, and full business level. So the cultures emerge from the behaviors of people, leaders throughout the organization, not just from one particular boardroom. And you can drive these behaviors, but you can't dictate them. So we're thinking about now, how do we use employee experience data to say something about this map of dimensions of culture that will give us a reference point for the things that we can do to drive it? I'll say briefly a little bit about the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative where I work. We think about research on effective human learning, not just what we imagine might be effective, but what does research show to be effective across a range of demographics. In the workforce, this research examines the intersection of learning and performance, and we're finding that that intersection is driving those two closer and closer together. Some call it learning in the flow of work, the idea that you want to get the learning as close to where you perform as possible. And that all happens within an organizational culture backdrop. I'm going to turn things over to Doug now to describe Energage and get into the methodology that we use to extract something about culture from the data.
Thanks so much, Jeff. So as Zach said, I'm the founder of Energage, and really came upon founding it out of the aerospace business, was surrounded by rocket scientists and folks who are passionate about space, but found that my passion was people science. And so founded Energage with the purpose of making the world a better place to work together. And the way we do that is we find the best cultures, top cultures through our top workplaces programs, figure out what makes them great cultures, and then we take those insights and then bring them out to all companies. And so, oops, if we go to the next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about organizational culture. Jeff shared a bunch of definitions of culture that are really theory-based. They are academic, top-down analyses of culture, and each has a specific purpose and a specific use, and a lot of work that went into them. Now, often when academics study culture, they're doing it from within their own culture, which is an academic one, and it is often very different from more commercial cultures or even other nonprofit cultures. And so you end up with a top-down construction of culture. But in terms of understanding what a culture, how employees experience culture, it really is not going to help us understand that. So from a practice perspective, the folks at Mightily and Energage put our heads together and we said, what does culture look like from the employee experience? And every employee is going to experience culture a little differently. So if you zoom out and we go back to my my aerospace background a little bit, and you think about a satellite view of culture, and where we could zoom into every employee's experience of culture and then pull up and try to understand that from a bottoms up perspective, what would that look like? Now, Yogi Berra is credited with saying, in theory, that theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they ain't. So we're going to first take a look at, we're going to look at three different lenses on culture. The first two are common across all cultures. We're going to look at engagement and culture drivers. Engagement is a word that gets bandied about a lot in discussions around culture and organization. And it's pretty universally accepted that you want engaged employees at your workplace. We define engagement as folks who want to stick around. So that's the retention element. Folks who would refer their company onto others, sometimes called the NPS question. So would you refer this working here to your friend? And then the third one is about motivation. People who, employees who will give that extra bit of effort to further the company's purpose. And we measure engagement as a element of culture or a measurement of culture that's common across all cultures and something that is a sign of a really top culture. So that's one lens and a term you'll hear a lot about, and something that that we at Energage measure. If you go on the next slide, well, what actually drives engagement? It turns out culture drives engagement, and there are some universal aspects of culture that we can measure and that we can influence and that we can make a difference on. So we've tested roughly 1,000 different statements, 1,000 different drivers of culture to see which ones have the highest correlation with engagement. So using a data and science-based approach. And these 15 drivers, which fit into 4 imperatives, are the drivers that make the biggest difference, that move the needle the most on engagement. So the first one is about aligning, and sometimes think about this as kind of the head. And so aligning on values, aligning on where the company's headed, aligning around cooperation between departments, and then aligning in meetings. We spend a lot of time in meetings, and so we've seen that meetings that make a good use of your time is a sign of a good culture. The second imperative is around the hands. And so this is kind of getting stuff done, performing as a business, as an organization. So that's doing things efficiently and well. It's about different points of view. It's about innovation. And it's also about ensuring that senior leaders are clued in to what's really happening in the company. The third one is about the heart. And so this is about feeling a sense of connection, feeling like the work is meaningful, feeling that you're appreciated, feeling that you're well informed, you're not out of the loop. And then also feeling like you're operating at your full potential at work. So that's the heart imperative, connect. The last one is about coach, and it's about this special relationship of your manager as a coach, not as somebody who micromanages you or tells you what to do, but somebody who can coach you in your work. And so the three statements that we've tested over the years that have had the highest correlation with engagement are: my manager cares about my concerns, my manager makes it easier to do my job well, and my manager helps me to learn and grow. So these are all aspects of culture which are common to all workplaces. Every workplace is going to score a little better or a little worse on these. And so you can find your hot spots and your bright spots. And if you were to participate in our top workplaces survey, you can find out how your culture does on these different aspects of culture. But it doesn't answer the question, what is unique about your culture? And every culture is unique in each organization and in even in different departments within an organization. So we ask a third question to assess how your culture is unique. And that question is an open-ended one. So we're not giving you sort of the answer and then asking you to agree or disagree with it. We ask for the three words that best define your organization's culture. And we're going to have an activity here for the group in a minute. So get ready for this and start to think about how you might answer this question, but don't do anything just yet. So if you go to the next, if you just advance for a second, the question we ask is, what three words best describe the culture at your organization? And these are real answers from a company that's near and dear to my heart, from individual employees. And one of those employees said it's about teamwork, diversity, and fun. Another one at that same organization said it is fast-paced, committed, and supportive. And then another one said it's pressure, hectic, and open. So all the same company, but all pretty different lenses on that culture. You could start to maybe try to knit some things together about that company by looking at those three, but it also looks a bit scattered in terms of maybe this is three different companies these three different people work from. So we asked about 1 million employees this question. And that's over the last 18 months or so. And then this came out with those 1 million employees came with about 3 million words. So that was an awful lot for Jeff and I to read. Jeff was up for it, but I thought that seems like too much. And so we brought in some data scientists to use some natural language processing and some techniques like word2vec and others to cluster the words and to look at, are there ways that these words start to relate to each other in any kind of way that we can make some generalizations about how employees experience culture from the ground up in practice, as opposed to sort of from the top down in theory. So I said a minute ago, we were going to do a little exercise here. We're going to ask you all to enter the three words that best describe your culture at your organization in the chat. And you can just put all three in at once, and don't think too hard about this. This is right off the top of your head. No right or wrong answers. And so if you could just chat, just put those in the chat. We'll give you just a minute to do that. All right. Disorganized, stale, inefficient, teamwork, family orientated, and fast paced. What else do we have? Fun, learning, and family. Fast paced, there's another fast paced. Change, diverse, people, values, synergy. Dedicated, family orientated, hardworking, structure, support, and busy. Give just a second for anybody else that wants to pop their culture words, the words that best describe their culture, in the chat. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, we asked those million employees, and now a million plus 33 or so, to answer that question, to describe their organization. And when we start from the bottom up, those 3 million words, and then we use data science to arrange them into different buckets. They're actually called bags of words, which is a technical term, surprisingly, bag of words. Turns out that they fall into about 24 different bags. And those words are words like friendly, family, and caring, which was the biggest individual bag of words, but also toxic, tense, and unappreciated. We've heard some of those words from the folks who bravely put their culture words in the chat. We also see words like fun, positive, and helpful, but words like negative, hard, and uncertain. And then even words like innovative or conservative or flexible or micromanaged. So those 3 million words fall into a bunch of different buckets. And you can see that even in the word like, some of them have an awful lot of words in those word buckets. So we then took some humans and said, a group of experts, and said, well, if we take those bags of words that the algorithms came up with and we and name them, we gave them these names. And so you see friendly, family, caring came up with friendly, toxic, tense, and unappreciated came up with hostile, etc. And so you can scroll down, you can scan down that and can see the different elements that came up. And then we took that group and we said, do these fall, are there any commonality between these different areas? So we saw some pairings first. Friendly and hostile fell under the category of caring. Fair and unfair came under fairness. Energetic and stagnant came under pace, etc. So we had these 24 elements and these 12 dimensions. Well, we did notice that there was some natural groupings here between them as we're working from the bottom up. And you can see that listed them down the left-hand side: relate, feel, and do. So we go to the next slide, and now we look at that data. Instead of looking at bottom up, we look at it top down. The area that had the most words when people were asked to describe their culture, how they experience it, unprompted in any other way, was actually about how people relate to each other. So 38% of the words were how they treat each other. And so 38% of those words were in areas like caring, in terms of how you relate, inclusiveness, how fair you are, and then how you relate in terms of well-being. The second one was about how people feel. And so areas like the vibe of the company, is that positive or negative, upbeat, downbeat? We heard some different feelings in the culture words that people shared in the chat. Whether people are really passionate and committed or less so. And then whether things are kind of fast paced, and that came up a couple times in the chat window. And then style was really, the other ones we've talked about so far tended to have a positive and negative element to them. Style was more, is it relaxed or casual? The third area, and maybe a little surprisingly, was the actual doing stuff. And so how people get work done. So is it collaborative? We saw the word teamwork come up in a number of the chat words. Innovation, so is it an idea factory, or is it more of a process driven where innovation is not as valued? People feel like the work, they're given autonomy in their work, or do they feel like it is more micromanaged? And then is it really productive or really unproductive? So the ground up experience of the workplace in practice falls into these three dimensions of relate, feel, and do. And I'm a little bit of a nerd, as you probably heard from my description. So for me, my acronym for thinking of this is RFID, or radio frequency device, but RFD, relate, feel, do. So if we go on to the next slide, we've now taken that employee experience and mapped out the dimensions of culture. So our next contention was that if you understand where your culture is on this map, as a leader, you're best positioned to take your culture in the direction that you want to take it. So we say that leaders can drive but not dictate culture. And early on, and Jeff, I think, alluded to this in the upfront, the culture and values values are part of culture, but if you can ensure that they're aligned, you can make a difference. It's also important to lead by example, lead by demonstration, and be consistent with that culture. You want to establish processes that reinforce the culture that you want. And you want to hire people who are going to be a good fit or a good add to that desired culture. So these are the 4 ways that leaders can drive, but not dictate culture. The first one, ensuring culture and values are aligned and ideally consistent. Sean up front talked about values being gutsy. And so I thought that was kind of a cool way to think about it. We just took a look at Intuit's value. Intuit's a very successful culture that has really done very well as a business also. And they were pretty thoughtful about their values: integrity without compromise, stronger together, courage, you care and give back, and customer obsession. What's interesting about the way that they've done that is it's not just those words and labels that people could really interpret maybe any way they wanted to, or could maybe have wide stretches of it. They then took the values and they came up with what are the essential behaviors that we could observe that would demonstrate that people are actually living those values. So things like we speak the truth and assume intent. This is something I can, to understand Jeff's values, I might have to look in his ear and see what his values are, but I can really see how he demonstrates those values in the way he acts, in his behaviors. And so Intuit has done a really nice job of not only laying out their values in a couple of short words, but also expanding on that with the desired behaviors. Now, Jeff and I were looking at this, and Jeff noticed something about that first column. Jeff.
Yeah, so this first column, I'm sure entirely coincidentally, fell into our relate category. I was, first of all, relieved isn't the right word, but I guess excited to see the way Intuit thinks about this because of their transition to the behaviors. And I've got a personal stake in it. My son is doing a software internship there this summer. I certainly knew of Intuit as a culture positive organization. I've done work with Intuit and know people there. And it's not just a thing that's been on their website. It's a thing that I've seen in action. But the alignment with our thinking came out pretty interesting here. I suspect many of you can see where the rest of this slide is headed.
Yeah, the second column, once again, quite accidentally, was around feeling. So the first one is courage, and what could be, how better to think about feeling than a feeling of courage. And then the second one is about caring and giving back. So again, a feeling, it's how we feel. We're stewards of the future. We strengthen our communities. That's a feeling.
Of course, we conclude with do. I love the phrasing of we fall in love with our customers' problems, because the customers aren't really falling in love with those problems, but that's what a good company does, is they provide products and services that allow you to overcome that. We were wondering, the final one there, we sweat every detail of the experience to deliver excellence. We're sure that every detail of this value statement has been sweated, maybe as much as they sweat customer problems. Leading by demonstration, like the communication of what you're about, is a necessary but not sufficient piece of the puzzle here. For example, that is examples of leading by demonstration, and we'll tie each of these back to one of our clusters, in this case, relate, one of our dimensions, caring, and the two elements that make up that dimension, in this case, friendly and hostile. Ask people how they're doing. You could certainly imagine a cynic might say, yeah, but you might not mean it. It's actually probably true that here's a case of where beliefs follow actions. The more people start doing this, even if they're going through the motions, the more they start to see the traction that it gets, and the more they start to realize this is actually an authentic part of what I as a leader am doing with this company, not just a thing I was taught in a fantastic presentation that should have been in Madison but wasn't. Ask how you can help, right? How you're doing is part of it, but the next step, how you can help. And implement a no asshole rule, for instance. That says something about your culture. Maybe you're a bit casual in terms of your language, or even you've crossed even beyond casual into some more difficult terrain if you have to explain that when your children come across your value statement. But that says a lot. Everybody gets it, and it's the kind of thing that can be actionable.
Jeff, don't you belong to a group that has a no asshole rule? I thought you mentioned that at one point.
I do. I'm on a cycling team. I'm at the slower end of this cycling team, so don't expect to turn on the Tour de France on Saturday and see me in it. That's the one team rule. Lots of things follow from that, but the founders of this team 15 years ago decided that's where they were going to start. Not you've got to be fast, or you've got to be great riding in a pack, or technically good on a mountain bike. Just don't be an asshole.
Awesome. So go ahead.
I was just going to tee this up for you, Doug. The feel, cluster, and pace. Manage energy, not people.
Yeah, this is one that one of my favorites. It turns out that people don't generally want to be managed. They might want to be led, but they don't want to be managed. That brings a sense of sort of micromanagement and that sort of a thing. Cy Wakeman is one of the really thought leaders in the area of accountability and drama. And this is one of her phrases that she uses a lot: manage energy and not people. Well, one of the big word buckets that we found in the way people describe their culture is around this notion of pace. And for energetic, they use terms like engaging and busy and energetic and challenging. And in the stagnant bucket, they use terms like stressed, stagnant, and confused. Well, what does it mean to manage energy? That means to be aware of the energy of your team. Are things moving along with pace? Are people feeling energized at work and engaged? Or are things really starting to bog down and feel like you're just stuck in quicksand? And as a manager, you can do that not only in sort of the broad project sense, but even in a meeting. Meetings are getting boring. You can manage the energy and the pace of that meeting. And that's one way as a leader to lead by demonstration, is managing your own energy and then managing your team's energy.
Our final group here in the do cluster around autonomy: fail small and learn. And we hear a lot about that. It's safe to fail here, fail forward. And I think fail forward captures it. People may focus on the fail part of that. It's the forward part of that that really matters. You don't want to punish people for honest mistakes, for mistakes of trying, but you also don't want to just leave it there. Everything has to drive towards the success of the organization, success delivering its mission. Of course, this is a choice. You may decide that failure has a high price. Perhaps you run a hospital. Perhaps you're in the financial industry, fields where there's a lot of compliance rules, which may end up being more hierarchical. So you have to think about when each of these what you might do points fits your culture versus not. You might, for instance, want to run a hostile company, and maybe the final rule here is one that you wouldn't invoke.
So the next area is around processes. And one of the great things about establishing and following a process is it's kind of like the habits of organizations. It's kind of a parallel to the habits that people have. Once that process is in place and it's off and running, that will start to embed elements of culture into your culture and start to really take you in that direction that you'd like to head. So the first examples we have up are for relate, and well-being, safe versus stressful, was one of the word bag pairings that came up in that ground up analysis. And one of the ways to processes that you can put in place is to create a regular pulse surveys to find out how your employees are doing in well-being. This came to the front during the pandemic and during COVID, but really great cultures, really top cultures were doing this before COVID and checking in on employees on well-being, because it's really difficult to do your best work if you're stressed out and you're not, and you're really not at your best from a well-being perspective. Now, in terms of other processes that you can put in place, there are great well-being programs out there, from mindfulness to health to nutrition to sleep. And so we see really top cultures that demonstrate they care about their people and the connection between culture and performance, ensuring that their employees are really looking after their well-being across these different dimensions. Next area is around commitment. And I think, Jeff, you had some thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so the repeated iteration or reiteration of what you're about is important. All too often we spend weeks, months, years crafting mission statements and vision statements. They get posted, they may be on a literal poster, they're certainly on a website or an intranet, but they don't get revisited. And that's sending a strong signal that you've checked a box to get them there, not that they're integral to the way you are and worth repeating. There's a finding in learning science about spacing and interleaving. Spacing means it's better to space learning out over some time. After each learning, you forget a little bit, and with each re-injection of the instruction, you pop your understanding back up, and eventually that learning ends up in your long-term memory and becomes part of habit and part of behavior. If you're just sharing the mission statement in the employee handbook that you hand to somebody on day one and they never see it again, it's pretty easy to get cynical about what the value of that mission statement is.
Yeah, Jeff, before we go on to the do there, I would just add to that our purpose at Energage is to help make the world a better place to work back together. And from a process perspective, one of our members of our management team really has taken on the responsibility from a process perspective of ensuring that we bring that up at really every employee communication. We might be talking about how were sales in the third quarter, but we then link that to our purpose. So the last one is around do and around teamwork and siloed. And apologies if you hear some noise in the background. At work from home, we got just exactly this moment there's some yard work noise going on. But the words that were in that teamwork versus silo that came up in that ground up definition of culture, for teamwork, it was words like teamwork, collaborative. And for siloed, it was siloed, disconnected, divided, disjointed. And for this one, I think the siloed word actually gives more insight into this dynamic than the collaboration words. And so what are some things you can do from a process perspective to address silos? You can create cross-functional teams. You can have people move laterally from team to team to create that sense of connection between different groups, or two different process things that you can do around teamwork and silo.
Before we move on to the hiring piece, I want to come back to the first point here about surveys to collect employee information. The act on piece is very important. If people feel like they're just dumping their thoughts into a void and they never get acted on, at best you'll get people doing answering the survey as more of a requirement than something that they think can help move the organization. So as a leader, talking about, we heard you, and here's what we're doing in response, maybe as part of the communications in the field group, maybe as part of how teams work together, is really important.
Yeah, I would just double down on that, Jeff. There's people throw the term survey fatigue around. Survey fatigue is really a myth. The fatigue is lack of action fatigue. So if I ask you your opinion and then ask again, but nothing ever changes, then that's where the fatigue comes in.
So let's take a look at the last of our actions that leaders can take. Hiring people who are a good fit with desired cultures. perhaps an apple pie and motherhood statement. In our relate cluster and looking at inclusiveness, over-recruit among underrepresented populations. For all the right reasons, DEI is front and center. It's a challenge, though. To find people who you're not finding, you probably would have found them before if you didn't have this challenge. And a way to do it is to really over-index on the effort to pull people into your recruiting pools. It was several years ago, but Trek, the bicycle manufacturer, really focused in an industry that's heavily male. We're talking about executives, bike mechanics, salespeople, store owners, heavily indexes male. And their response to this was to make sure that they were maybe spending 10x the effort getting candidates, female candidates, into their hiring pool. At that point, they were looking to hire the best people, the people to help them deliver on their mission. But it's a lot harder for a woman to break through that ceiling if she's 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 in a hiring pool. Trek happens to have a reputation for equal payouts to male and female racers in the races that they host. So they're acting on this in a couple of ways. There's the feel and style. Doug mentioned professional versus casual. One of the few areas here where there's not necessarily an obvious desirable or less desirable set of dimensions. Doug, you might want to talk to this. You mentioned something that I found a bit amusing, particularly given the industry that the company you were talking about was in. And you're muted.
I'm muted because of the yard work here, which has subsided. So a company very friendly with, where we had the opportunity to get a tour of the facility, and we were told that we had to wear a jacket and preferably a collared shirt and preferably a tie. And I thought that was really unusual in 2021. This is a very large, very successful company, but they have an intentional culture around a professional look. And so if you don't like that kind of, if you don't like dressing up for work, then that's the wrong company for you. But they've hired a bunch of people for who like to dress up for work, presumably, or like to like a professional look. And they've been very, very successful at it. And it's part of their culture. And so you don't show up in a t-shirt at this company.
And it's a fairly industrial company too. So we're not talking about Google, for instance.
Yeah, for example.
So our final one here in the do cluster around innovation. During interviewing, you can administer creativity assessments. And I think that's a trend maybe in the last 10 years in hiring, is to start to think about delivering assessments rather than just having a conversation across a table. There's a lot of evidence that shows 18 months after a new hire, roughly 50% of new hires are successful. That's not great for the people being hired, and it's certainly not great for the companies. And so assessments around, for instance, the traits that make a good salesperson are very much a way to think about how you're hiring in conjunction with your normal interview practices. I'm going to shift things back to Doug as we revisit the definitions that we saw at the beginning.
So we looked at a couple different definitions, and after we'd gone through the analysis, we went back to look at them again with this lens on culture based on the employee experience. And 3 of them kind of lined up with each other. The first one was from Gallup, how we do things around here. The second one was from SHRM, how things get done in your workplace. Sound pretty similar. And then the third one from Josh Burson is what people do when nobody is looking. And so these 3 all share one thing in common, which is the word do or done or root of do. But it turns out that when you're looking at culture, do is only 1/3 of the equation. So there's 2/3 of the equation that actually outrank do in terms of how people think about culture and how often they use it. The first one is about relate, or how we treat each other. The second one is about feel. So what we feel when we work here, how this makes us feel. And then the last one is do, how we get work done. So do is 1/3 of it. But from the ground up, from a practice perspective, from the employee experience, this is how culture actually happens, not academically and not theoretically, but out there in reality. So going to the next slide, our guess is that everybody here cares a lot about culture, or you wouldn't be at a conference called CultureCon. And Zach used the term culture nerds, and so glad to be with a bunch of culture nerds. So in terms of a short definition of culture and a way to think about it, is the way that employees experience culture is how you relate, how people relate, feel, and do in the workplace. So there's 3 questions that we suggest you must answer. The first question is, what is our culture now? And that's the technique that Energage uses with the 3-word culture question. The second one is, what is the culture we aspire to? And in a minute, we're going to ask for another audience participation task, which is around aspirational culture. So start thinking about the culture that you would aspire to for your organization. And then the third question is, how do we move from our culture now to our aspirational culture? So just note for this exercise, you can put the aspirational culture in the chat. You can either direct it to everybody, or you can just direct it to the panelists, and we'll just read them out here. So take just a second here and think about, from an aspirational perspective, what's a culture that you'd love to work in for your workplace? So it should be about you, but also about your team and the business your organization is in, and what would make a really awesome top culture that's going to excel in your field.
So yeah, let's take a couple minutes, another 3-word contest. If you're really interested in a different kind of geekiness, take your 3 words after the fact. There's a mapping site called what3words.com, and they use 3 unique words to define 3 meter by 3 meter spots on a map. Maybe this gets back to Doug's satellite and rocket science experience. And you can actually find out where on the planet, which 3 meter by 3 meter space your 3 words correlate to. I don't want to distract anybody or drive anybody away from the presentation now, which we're in the process of winding down. Doug, I don't know if anything jumps out at you. I'm seeing innovative.
I would also ask you to look at it through the lens, through your 3 words, through the lens of relate, feel, do. Did you hit one of each? Did you hit all relate? So take a look at it through that lens of relate, feel, do. We see words like courageous, a feeling, fairness, which is about relating, consistency, inclusive, collaborative, empowering. How we do is collaborative, inclusive is a relationship one, empowering is a feeling. So seeing some of those different things, challenging, supportive, and upbeat. Upbeat is that notion of vibe. What's the vibe there? Innovative, welcoming, and challenging. Collaborative, fun, and innovative. Caring, which is that sort of category we talked about, the broader category of words. Teamwork and innovation. Courage, there's courage again, that feeling of courage that we saw at Intuit.
Doug, I think we should start a company with these people, because this sounds like a good group to work with.
Yeah, I would think so. So the aspirations. So thank you very much for sharing those aspirations. The very next step we have is to move on to Q&A, and I think we're right about on time for that. So the next step is, if you can put your questions into the chat, then any questions about anything that we've covered, or I guess anything that we haven't.
I saw one question in there from someone who I'm going to disappoint a bit with my answer. What would a creativity assessment look like? Are there references? There is, and it's not coming to me at the moment. If Doug and I had been really smooth at this, meaning if I had been, I would have gone off and Googled while Doug was leading the charge here. But if you look up creativity inventory, I think you'll find it, maybe out of UCLA. Creativity is an interesting topic because in some ways you think of it as if the second you measure it, you've destroyed the thing that makes it what it is. But there are validated assessments for creativity. And you might take a look at the questions and just see if those are even questions that you'd want to ask of a candidate. If so, you might find that, that you learned something from it.
What's a good way to interview candidates for culture fit? So I would actually just challenge that and add that you want to look at both culture fit and culture add. So both. If you're looking to steer a culture in a direction, you may want to hire for some of the attributes of culture that you're aspiring to, as opposed to the ones that you have. And so just first off, I would look at both fit and add. The second piece is, once you've laid out those values and essential behaviors, and or you've laid out those descriptions of aspirational culture you're looking for, you want to use experience questions to see if people have demonstrated those kinds of behaviors in the past. And so how do they do they have that kind of experience? Jeff, other thoughts on interviewing for culture fit?
Yeah, one, and it's really a general interviewing principle. Again, we'll blank on who the author is, but could certainly track it down, has looked at the research on interviewing and found, I believe, that there are something like 20 question types that get asked. And 19 of them don't really relate to successful hiring. And the one that does, it's a two-part question. You can ask people about how they've solved problems they've faced. Risk there is that a good storyteller can do reasonably well on that. And you can also present scenarios, challenges that a candidate might find in your workplace, and ask what they would do, how they would tackle it. Questions like that will get at what a good employee might be, and almost by definition then will get into a culture fit. Doug, I don't know if you saw the question somebody asked about the difference between fit versus add.
Sure. So culture fit broadly describes how does the interview candidate fit in your current culture. The problem, a number of problems with that is if your culture is, say, monolithically male and white, then you're likely going to either implicitly or explicitly end up saying, well, fitting in this culture would mean that you're male and white. From a behavioral perspective, if you are seeking out to create a culture that's more innovative and your current culture is not, then a fit would mean that you're not particularly innovative. So the difference between fit and add is to say, well, if I hire this person, are they going to add to my culture? Are they going to help me move the culture in the direction that I want to take it? So
there's a really interesting,
Jeff.
There's a really interesting pair of thoughts here. One suggests some interview questions. You observe a situation where the work is not progressing effectively, but you're not the direct owner or directly involved. How do you handle this? And then we have a question essentially saying, what are some tips for coaxing higher ups to commit to working on organizational culture? I love this question, and I love it because I have no idea. I'm going to hand it over to Doug.
There's a cold handover. So thanks for that, Jeff. If you are in an organization where the higher ups don't seem to get the importance of culture, First off, I'd wonder if they're just a little frozen in time from like the early 2000s or something. We've seen awareness around the importance of culture accelerating for the last 20 years, but we've seen more acceleration during the pandemic in terms of broad awareness about the importance of culture than really in any year before that. So it seems like it's running at 3 or 4 or 5 times faster. Now, what I recommend on a management team is not to try to change the entire management team, but identify who on a senior leadership team is going to be an advocate for culture. And so sometimes that's the CEO or the COO or the CHRO or the head of people or head of people operations, and then have that dialogue with that individual who's kind of going to be the advocate or the people advocate on the senior team. And then there are techniques out there, and certainly our Top Workplaces program is one of them, where it's free to participate with that. You can find out where you stand. You find out, you get an understanding of your culture at a very top level. And so that is an example of something that you can do with your senior leadership team to as a start.
And I think if we come back to lead by example, we made the point that really you have leaders throughout your organization. It may not feel like the word travels far or fast, but you can influence your team. I've just, even as not the leader of that team, I recently finished what was normally an in-person course, but took it online, called Humor X. And it's about the use of humor in the workplace. And there's all sorts of data that shows that workplaces that use appropriate of course, humor, tend to have good cultures, get more done. And there are tips about when to inject humor, how to inject humor, particularly when you're not the leader of the group. But people will notice that, and will notice the responses that you get and how people will interact with you in a good way, and start to realize that that's a valuable trait. I notice here we have a commenter who's almost apologizing for adding comments to the chat box. The presenter's &1 fear is crickets and silence. So you will not get dinged at all for enlivening the chat.
I want to get back to a question from Lisa Murray of WARF. She asked any recommendations that might be specific for smaller companies less than 100. Certainly encourage you to check out the Top Workplaces program that will work down to organizations of 50 or so. When you're under 100, you're under Dunbar's number of 130, and we have a lot of culture nerds out here, so probably a higher percentage of people who bumped into Dunbar than in the general population. But you're in that size that is, kind of a small village from a human evolution perspective. And so you're at the point where you have a decent chance of kind of knowing each other. And so it's a little easier to move a culture when you're below that 130 number, Dunbar's number. But if you're not paying attention to culture and it's accidental, or you've got leaders that are doing the opposite of leading by example, or their example is not a good one, then that can also feel a bit outsized as well, given the small size of the company. And so certainly encourage you to check out Top Workplaces to find out where you stand. But your influence as a member of a company that's less than 100 can be a lot more, even if you're, no matter what level you are in the organization, whether you have a team that you lead or, but you can be a leader around culture and can potentially have even more influence in a smaller group.
I saw a great point here about a don't do, which is we've got a bad culture, we need to fix it. You as a leader may believe that, and you may want to take action on that, but somebody makes the interesting point of, let's have a conversation about what our current culture is. In essence, where are we on that map? And let's talk about where we want to go. This is let's make things better, not things are bad. And that simple reframing, I think, leads to a much more positive conversation than the it's bad, it's toxic, we've got to turn the super tanker, or I guess in the case of the 100-person company, the tugboat.
So Dawn Green asks, can you give examples of successful programs or initiatives that you are familiar with that create great cross-functional teams? So what I've seen work really well is using a cadence of annual kind of rocks is the term that you'll see. So big initiatives that you're trying to run, and then sort of quarterly programs that will seek to move the needle on a company-wide, something that would require input from different members of the company, different elements of the company each quarter. So you establish, typically at the senior leadership team level, but with input from the rest of the company, what are the very small number of priorities that are going to be cross-functional that you're going to focus on for the year and then for the quarter. And then you want to ideally find up and coming leaders who can step up and volunteer to lead those teams. Then you look for volunteers. Typically, you're going to want people that leader to have a hand in choosing their team. But then it's critical to establish the objectives, the key results, SMART goals, whatever you want to call them, OKRs or MBOs or SMART goals for that group. And then it's really important that senior leadership have a cadence of checking in on the progress of those cross-functional teams, and that those get treated in a similar way to the departmental goals and objectives. Otherwise, people will get the message that they're not that important. So I hope that's helpful in terms of examples of great cross-functional teams.
Let me ask a follow-on to Dawn's question, because I could create a cross-functional team tomorrow. I might not create a great one. I'd be interested to know, Doug, what you think about what almost become cliched trust activities or team building activities. It's one thing if you've got a cross-functional team that's worked before and demonstrated that they work well together. Is that sort of management myth, or are there ways to do things so that you get the relate part as the foundation for the feel and then the do part?
Yeah, I guess the team formation guidance that says you're going to have forming, storming, norming, and performing is true on cross-functional teams just like it is anywhere else. And so you want to not try to leap to the performing part before you step through the forming, storming, and norming. And ideally kind of keep your storming a little bit to a minimum. And so the temptation sometimes with a cross-functional team is to jump right to the doing, but to use the terms that we did from our culture bottom-up exercise, making sure that you keep an eye on the relating and the feeling is that forming, norming part of it, and possibly some of the storming. So Jeff, does that help a little bit?
Yeah, so we're probably at the part where Zach is saying, are these guys ever going to stop? Do I have to come in with the hook? And Zach, we are. I'll end with a thought, and then Doug, certainly you can as well. This notion of Agile and Scrum frameworks, I think Agile isn't for software developers only. That may be where it started. I don't know the origins there. But Agile, the notion of an MVP, a minimum viable product, let's get a thing done and test the thing and iterate, is not just about making a thing, but it's about making a process. It's about people working together. I'll put up a thank you slide, which has some contact information on it. But Doug, I'll give you the floor for any last thoughts.
Just to say, it's a real pleasure to be with a group of culture nerds. Really enjoyed the interaction and would have also look forward to enjoying it in person in the future, even more so than virtual. And just encourage you to really take these learnings back into your workplaces, and also to reach out to Jeff and I if you want to learn more about it, or if you have insights around it. I mean, this is a pretty elite group of culture nerds. And so You've got our email addresses up there. Reach out and share your thoughts on this work, and we'd appreciate it. It's not like it's done. I mean, this is really we're really pushing this thinking forward, and would appreciate your helping with that.